Right or wrong, did engagement rings really start in antiquity? When people say that engagement rings date back to ancient Rome, the statement usually carries a quiet implication that the glittering symbol placed on a finger today is part of an unbroken chain of romantic tradition stretching back 2,000 years. The story often goes like this. Roman lovers exchanged rings as tokens of eternal devotion, and ever since then, couples have sealed their promises with precious metal and stone. It sounds reassuring. It makes the modern ritual feel timeless, almost natural. But here, in History vs. Myths, we have to ask the uncomfortable question, right or wrong, did engagement rings really begin in antiquity in the way we imagine them today? The short answer is both yes and no. Rings did exist in ancient betrothal practices, but the meaning of those rings, the social world that produced them, and the people whose interests they served were profoundly different from the romantic narrative we inherit. Let's begin in ancient Rome. By the time of the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, marriage was less a private love affair and more a public contract between families. It was about alliances, citizenship, inheritance, and property. Elite marriages especially were strategic. They connected powerful households, stabilized political relationships, and ensured legitimate heirs. Love, if it appeared at all in the sources, was secondary. In fact, romantic love was often treated with suspicion by elite male writers who associated passion with instability and loss of control. Within this context, we do find references to betrothal rings. A Roman groom would give a ring to the bride-to-be during a formal engagement ceremony known as the sponsalia. At first glance, this seems like a clear ancestor of the modern engagement ring, but we have to look more closely at what that ring represented. The Roman betrothal ring, often made of iron rather than gold, symbolized agreement between families. Iron was not chosen for its beauty. It was chosen for durability and practicality. Some historians suggest that the iron ring represented strength and permanence, but it also reflected the everyday material culture of Rome. Gold rings were later adopted by wealthier classes, particularly by the 2nd century CE, but even then, the meaning of the ring was tied less to romance and more to legal recognition. Under Roman law, marriage was fundamentally about the transfer of a woman from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. This concept, known as manus in some forms of marriage, literally meant hand. A woman moved from one male guardian's hand to another's. The ring, placed on her finger, marked this transition. It was not a mutual exchange in most cases. It was a sign that she was spoken for, that negotiations had concluded. This is where the myth of romantic antiquity begins to crack. The Roman ring was not primarily a symbol of two individuals choosing each other out of love. It was a visible marker of a contract between families. It signaled that a dowry had been arranged, that obligations had been agreed upon, and that the woman's reproductive future was now tied to a specific household. Even the placement of the ring on the fourth finger of the left hand, a detail often cited as proof of ancient romantic symbolism, needs scrutiny. Later writers claimed that Romans believed a special vein, the vena amoris, or vein of love, ran directly from that finger to the heart. It's a beautiful story, but evidence for this belief in classical antiquity is thin, and much later sources may have projected it backward. The idea of the vein of love seems to gain clearer expression in medieval and early modern texts, not in surviving Roman medical literature. Once again, what feels ancient may actually be a later invention layered onto the past. We also have to consider who wrote the sources that survive. Most of what we know about Roman marriage comes from elite male authors, lawyers, poets, moralists. They were concerned with property, legitimacy, and social order. The voices of women, especially non-elite women, are largely silent. We can infer that marriage practices varied widely across the vast Roman world, from Italy to North Africa to the eastern provinces. Local customs blended with Roman law. Not every woman wore the same ring, and not every family followed the same ritual. But the dominant legal framework centered on control over property, over lineage, over women's bodies. This doesn't mean affection never existed. Roman poetry, especially from writers like Catullus and Ovid, overflows with desire and longing. Tomb inscriptions sometimes express deep personal grief for a spouse. Ordinary people were capable of love, attachment, and partnership, but the institution of engagement was not built around celebrating those emotions. It was built to regulate them. So when modern jewelers claim that the engagement ring is a tradition dating back to Rome, they are technically referencing something real. But they are also smoothing over the fundamental differences. The Roman ring was embedded in a patriarchal and hierarchical society in which women had limited legal autonomy. It was part of a system that treated marriage as a transaction with economic consequences. Consider the role of the dowry. In Roman marriage, the bride's family provided property or wealth to support the new household. This dowry remained legally significant. If the marriage dissolved, disputes could arise over its return. The engagement ring in this environment functioned alongside other financial arrangements. It was not a lavish standalone gift meant to demonstrate eternal devotion. It was one element in a broader contractual framework. There is another layer often ignored in popular retellings: slavery. Roman society was built on enslaved labor. Enslaved people could not legally contract marriage in the same way free citizens could. Their unions, known as contubernia, had no formal legal standing. They did not exchange official betrothal rings recognized by the state. So when we talk about ancient tradition, we are already talking about a restricted class of people, primarily free citizens with recognized legal rights. The romanticized narrative erases not only gender inequality, but also the vast population excluded from legal marriage altogether. This raises an important question. Why do we want the engagement ring to be ancient? Why is it comforting to imagine that our rituals are inherited from Rome? Part of the answer lies in authority. Western societies have long treated classical antiquity as a source of cultural legitimacy. To say something began in Rome is to say it has stood the test of time. It suggests continuity, stability, civilization. By rooting the engagement ring in antiquity, modern culture wraps it in the prestige of the classical past. But tradition is rarely a straight line. It is more like a patchwork quilt, stitched together from fragments of different eras, often reinterpreted to fit new social needs. The Roman betrothal ring did not pass unchanged through the centuries into our jewelry stores. It was reshaped by medieval church law, early modern property systems, industrial capitalism, and modern advertising, developments we will explore in later chapters. In fact, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, marriage customs shifted dramatically across Europe. Germanic traditions mixed with Christian doctrine. Rings continued to appear in some contexts, but their meanings evolved. There was no single, uninterrupted practice that looks exactly like the modern engagement ritual. Another myth embedded in the ancient origins story is the idea that precious stones were always central. While some wealthy Romans wore gem-set rings, the diamond engagement ring as a cultural expectation is a very recent development. In antiquity, diamonds were rare and not commonly used in Roman betrothal jewelry. The sparkling solitaire we now associate with proposals would have been unfamiliar to most ancient couples. What we are left with, then, is a more complicated picture. Yes, Romans had betrothal rings. Yes, these rings symbolized an agreement to marry. But no, they were not primarily declarations of romantic love in the modern sense. They functioned within a legal and economic system that prioritized family strategy over individual passion. When we strip away the marketing gloss, the Roman engagement ring looks less like a timeless emblem of devotion and more like a marker of ownership and obligation. It represented a promise, but a promise between households, enforced by law and social expectation. This doesn't mean modern couples are wrong to see their rings as symbols of love. Symbols change, meanings evolve. Objects acquire new emotional layers over time. The problem arises when we project our current values backward and claim them as universal and eternal. When we do that, we obscure the realities of the past and the power structures embedded within it. In a people-centered view of history, we ask different questions. How did ordinary Roman women experience engagement? Did they feel excitement, fear, resignation? The sources rarely tell us directly. We can imagine that experiences varied widely. Some marriages may have grown into affectionate partnerships. Others may have been marked by imbalance and constraint. The ring itself cannot tell us which story unfolded. What it can tell us is that marriage has long been intertwined with property and power. The myth of the ancient romantic ring softens this truth. It transforms a legal marker into a love token, and in doing so, makes our present practices seem inevitable rather than constructed. So, right or wrong, did engagement rings start in antiquity? If the claim is that Romans exchanged rings as part of betrothal ceremonies, then yes, there is historical evidence for that. But if the claim is that modern engagement rings descend directly from an ancient tradition of romantic love, then the answer is far more complicated and largely wrong. The Roman ring was not a diamond promise whispered under candlelight. It was a public sign of contract, authority, and alliance. To understand that difference is the first step in separating history from myth. And as we move forward, the story only becomes more revealing. Because if antiquity did not give us the engagement ring as we know it, then who did? And why did the meaning change so dramatically? If the ancient Roman ring was less about romance and more about contract, what happened after Rome? Did the Middle Ages transform the betrothal ring into a softer, more emotional symbol? Or did it become something even more tightly controlled, shaped by church law, property concerns, and anxiety over women's sexuality? To answer our right or wrong question, we have to move into medieval Europe, where marriage became not just a family arrangement but a sacrament under the authority of the Christian Church. And here, the story of the engagement ring becomes even more revealing. Because in the medieval period, the promise to marry was no small matter. It carried spiritual weight, legal consequences, and social risk, especially for women. By the 12th century, the Church had formalized marriage as one of the 7 sacraments. This meant that marriage was not merely a private contract between families. It was a sacred bond overseen by God and regulated by canon law. But there was a paradox at the heart of medieval Christian marriage. Officially, the Church taught that mutual consent between a man and a woman created a valid marriage. In theory, 2 people could exchange vows privately and be considered married in the eyes of God. That sounds surprisingly modern, almost romantic. Consent mattered. Words spoken in the present tense, such as "I take you as my wife" or "I take you as my husband," were legally binding. But the reality was more complicated. Families still negotiated matches. Dowries still moved wealth. Social class boundaries were fiercely guarded, and women's bodies, particularly their sexual purity, were treated as sites of intense regulation. This is where betrothal enters the picture. Medieval Europe distinguished between 2 kinds of marital promises: sponsalia de futuro, a promise to marry in the future, and sponsalia de praesenti, a present-tense exchange that constituted marriage itself. An engagement, in many cases, fell into that first category, a binding promise of future marriage. Rings were often used in these ceremonies. But again, we must ask, what did they signify? In many medieval communities, the giving of a ring during betrothal symbolized a formal commitment, one that could be enforced in ecclesiastical courts. If a man promised marriage and sealed it with a ring, and the woman relied on that promise, backing out could result in legal disputes. Church courts across Europe heard cases of broken engagements, contested vows, and disputes over whether a valid marriage had already been formed. The ring, then, was evidence. It was a token that something binding had occurred. In some cases, it functioned almost like a deposit, a visible sign that negotiations had progressed to a serious stage, but it was not yet the glittering centerpiece of an elaborate proposal ritual. It was part of a legal and religious framework concerned with legitimacy, inheritance, and moral order. The Church's emphasis on consent did open a small space for women's agency, at least in theory. A woman could argue in court that she had not freely consented to a marriage. She could claim coercion. She could insist that a prior promise made to another man was binding. But in practice, her social and economic vulnerability limited her choices. Families pressured daughters into advantageous matches. Breaking an engagement could damage a woman's reputation more severely than a man's. Virginity before marriage became a moral obsession. A woman who engaged in sexual relations after a betrothal, but before a church wedding, occupied a precarious position. In some communities, consummation following a future tense promise could transform the engagement into an indissoluble marriage. That meant a man could be compelled to marry if sexual relations had occurred under promise. At first glance, this might seem protective of women, but it also meant that a woman's honor and future hinged on male follow-through. If a man denied the promise or claimed no valid vow had been made, the burden of proof often fell on her. Witnesses mattered. Tokens like rings mattered. The body itself could become evidence in humiliating ways. So when modern narratives describe medieval betrothal rings as symbols of enduring love, they flatten a much more anxious reality. The ring was not simply a romantic gesture. It was entangled with surveillance of sexuality, protection of lineage, and control of women's reproductive capacity. Property remained central. Dowries in medieval Europe were substantial transfers of wealth, land, or goods from the bride's family to the groom. These arrangements were carefully negotiated and documented. Marriage alliances shaped political landscapes, especially among the nobility. A broken engagement could unravel strategic plans and ignite feuds. Among peasants and urban laborers, the stakes were different but no less serious. Marriage determined access to land, guild membership, and economic survival. A ring might be modest, silver rather than gold, but its meaning was embedded in survival strategies. Love may have existed, and surely did in many cases, but it operated within narrow constraints. There is also the question of symbolism. Medieval rings sometimes featured inscriptions or designs, clasped hands, hearts, or religious phrases. The feed ring, depicting two hands joined together, became popular in parts of Europe. This imagery suggests partnership and faithfulness. It complicates the story. We cannot reduce every medieval ring to a blunt instrument of patriarchy. Symbols of mutuality did circulate. Yet even these symbols existed within a hierarchy that placed husbands as heads of households. Under the legal doctrine later known as coverture in England, a married woman's legal identity was subsumed under her husband's. While this doctrine developed more fully in the early modern period, its roots lay in medieval legal culture. A wife's property, labor, and sexuality were tied to her husband's authority. The Church, meanwhile, insisted on the indissolubility of marriage. Divorce in the modern sense was not available in Catholic Europe. Annulments could be granted under specific circumstances, such as consanguinity or prior vows, but these were complex, and often favored the powerful who could navigate ecclesiastical bureaucracy. For ordinary people, marriage was for life. In that context, the engagement period was fraught. It was a liminal space between singlehood and married status. A ring worn during this period signaled to the community that a woman was no longer fully available. It marked her body as claimed, though not yet fully transferred. Gossip, reputation, and honor swirled around this stage. And here we return to the myth of timeless romance. Modern jewelers often describe the engagement ring as an ancient expression of eternal love. But medieval sources show that eternity was less about personal emotion and more about sacramental permanence. The Church framed marriage as a reflection of Christ's unbreakable bond with the Church. It was theological before it was romantic. Even courtly love, that famous medieval literary tradition of knights and ladies, operated largely outside marriage. Courtly poetry celebrated longing, secrecy, and unattainable desire, often directed at married women. It did not create the institution of the engagement ring. If anything, it revealed tensions between idealized love and socially arranged marriage. So was the medieval period the birthplace of our modern engagement ritual? Not quite. Rings were there. Promises were there. Emotional attachment was certainly present in human lives, but the structure surrounding those rings was dominated by religious authority and economic negotiation. We also need to widen our lens beyond Western Europe. Medieval societies across the world practiced betrothal in diverse ways. In parts of the Islamic world, for example, marriage contracts included the mahr, a mandatory gift from groom to bride, which legally belonged to her. In Jewish communities, betrothal rituals involved the giving of a ring under specific legal formulae. In many African and Asian societies, bride wealth or other exchanges structured marriage alliances. The European narrative is only one thread in a global tapestry. Yet the story most often told in Western popular culture centers Europe as the origin point of our tradition. This reinforces a narrow lineage from Rome to medieval Christendom to modern jewelry stores. It obscures both global diversity and the discontinuities within Europe itself. By the late medieval and early modern periods, the exchange of rings during marriage ceremonies became more standardized in parts of Europe. Liturgical texts included instructions for blessing the ring. The gesture of placing the ring on the bride's finger became integrated into church ritual. But even then, the engagement ring and the wedding ring were not always clearly distinct in the way they are today. Practices varied widely by region and class. What remains consistent is this: rings functioned within systems of power. They were not free-floating symbols of love detached from economics or law. They were embedded in structures that regulated women's bodies, secured property transmission, and reinforced social hierarchies. So, right or wrong, did medieval Europe inherit the ancient romantic engagement ring and pass it down to us unchanged? Wrong, if we imagine a simple, sentimental evolution. The medieval betrothal ring was shaped by canon law, dowry systems, and intense concern over legitimacy. It could protect, constrain, or endanger depending on circumstance. It offered some space for consent, yet operated within a deeply patriarchal order. The myth of the ancient, romantic ring survives because it smooths out these tensions. It allows modern consumers to feel part of a noble, continuous tradition. But when we look closely, we see a series of transformations, each responding to the anxieties of its time. And this sets the stage for an even more dramatic shift. Because if antiquity and the Middle Ages gave us rings rooted in contract and sacrament, the next major transformation would tie the engagement ring not just to marriage, but to global capitalism, colonial extraction, and the invention of modern romance itself. If antiquity gave us rings rooted in contract, and the medieval world wrapped them in sacrament and social control, then where did the diamond come from? When did the engagement ring transform from a modest token of agreement into a sparkling declaration that feels almost mandatory today? This is where the myth begins to collapse completely. Because the diamond engagement ring, the image that dominates jewelry ads, romantic films, and social media proposals, is not ancient. It is not medieval. It is not even early modern in any widespread sense. It is, in large part, a product of the 19th century and the economic forces unleashed by industrial capitalism and empire. For centuries, diamonds were rare in Europe. They were mined primarily in India, and their supply was limited. A few elite figures possessed diamond jewelry. One oft-cited example is the 1477 ring Archduke Maximilian of Austria reportedly gave to Mary of Burgundy. It featured small diamonds arranged in the shape of an M. This story is frequently presented as proof that diamond engagement rings are centuries old. But here's the crucial detail. This was not a mass custom. It was an aristocratic exception. The vast majority of Europeans, peasants, laborers, even much of the middle class, did not exchange diamond rings. Diamonds were scarce, expensive, and inaccessible. There was no widespread social expectation that an engagement required a diamond. In fact, engagement rings themselves were far from universal in the early modern period. In some communities, they were common, in others, less so. Rings might feature colored gemstones, simple bands, or even inscriptions without stones. The idea that a clear, sparkling diamond is the only proper symbol of engagement would have seemed strange to most people before the 19th century. So what changed? The answer lies beneath the soil of southern Africa. In 1867, a young boy reportedly found a shiny stone on the banks of the Orange River in what is now South Africa. That stone turned out to be a diamond. Within a few years, massive diamond deposits were discovered near Kimberley. Suddenly, the global supply of diamonds shifted dramatically. But abundance posed a problem. Diamonds derive their value not only from their physical properties but from their perceived rarity. If diamonds flooded the market, prices would fall. Their aura of exclusivity would evaporate. To prevent this, a small group of entrepreneurs consolidated control over diamond production. The most famous of them was Cecil Rhodes. By the late 19th century, Rhodes had helped establish De Beers Consolidated Mines, a company that would come to dominate global diamond supply. Through a combination of aggressive acquisition, political maneuvering, and imperial power, De Beers gained control over the majority of the world's diamond production. This was not just a business story, it was a colonial story. The diamond mines of South Africa were sites of intense labor exploitation. African workers were subjected to harsh conditions, strict surveillance, and racial segregation. Past laws controlled their movement. Compound systems confined workers to prevent theft. The wealth extracted from the earth flowed disproportionately to European investors and imperial networks. When we hold up a diamond ring as a timeless symbol of love, how often do we think about the colonial systems that made mass diamond consumption possible? In the late 19th century, diamonds were becoming more available, but demand did not automatically rise to meet supply. For most people, diamonds were still a luxury, not a necessity. Engagement rings existed, but they were not yet standardized around a single stone type. The real transformation came in the early 20th century, and especially in the 1930s and 1940s, when marketing reshaped cultural expectations. By the 1930s, the diamond market was in trouble. The Great Depression had slashed luxury spending. Diamonds were not selling as they once had. De Beers turned to advertising agencies to solve the problem. They needed to create not just customers, but desire. Not just desire, but obligation. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity, linked diamonds to love in a way that felt ancient and inevitable. Advertising campaigns began to suggest that a diamond engagement ring was not merely a gift, but a measure of commitment. The size and quality of the diamond became tied to the depth of a man's devotion. Slowly, the idea took hold that a real proposal required a diamond. In 1947, copywriter Francis Jarity coined the slogan that would define an era: "A diamond is forever." With those 4 words, the diamond was fused with the concept of eternal love. The slogan implied permanence, indestructibility, and emotional depth. It also subtly discouraged resale. If a diamond is forever, you do not resell it. You keep it, preserving demand. This was not the continuation of an ancient Roman tradition. It was a 20th century marketing triumph built on 19th century colonial extraction. The campaign extended beyond print ads. Hollywood films began to feature glamorous proposals with diamond rings. Celebrities wore them. Magazines published guidelines suggesting how much a man should spend, eventually popularizing the idea of 2 months' salary as a benchmark. What had once been optional became expected. The brilliance of the campaign lay in how it rewrote memory. Advertisements often implied that diamonds had always symbolized eternal love. They drew on vague references to history, medieval romance, royal betrothals, ancient customs, without clarifying how rare and unstandardized diamond use had actually been. Within a few decades, the shift was dramatic. In the United States, the percentage of brides receiving diamond engagement rings rose sharply in the mid-20th century. What had once been a luxury for the elite became a near-universal middle-class aspiration, and this model did not remain confined to North America. De Beers expanded its marketing globally. In post-war Japan, for example, diamond engagement rings were virtually unknown before the mid-20th century. Through targeted campaigns in the 1960s and 1970s, De Beers linked diamonds to modern Western romance. By the end of the century, a majority of Japanese brides received diamond engagement rings. This is how tradition is manufactured, not through uninterrupted continuity, but through strategic storytelling. Now, does this mean diamonds had no symbolic associations before the modern era? Not at all. Diamonds were admired for their hardness and brilliance. They appeared in royal jewelry. They carried connotations of strength, but they were not universally tied to engagement. That connection had to be cultivated, and it was cultivated in a world shaped by industrial capitalism. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of mass consumer culture. Department stores flourished. Advertising became more sophisticated. Emotional appeal replaced purely functional marketing. Products were sold not just for what they did, but for what they meant. The engagement ring became a perfect vehicle for this shift. It was intimate. It was visible. It was public. A ring worn on the hand signaled relationship status to the community. It combined private emotion with social display. There is also a gendered dimension that echoes earlier centuries. The expectation that a man should prove his worth through a costly ring reinforced older ideas about male provision and female desirability. The ring became a test. How much is she worth? How serious is he? While framed as romantic, these questions were deeply economic. Meanwhile, the labor behind the diamond remained largely invisible. African miners, later joined by workers in other parts of the world as new deposits were discovered, endured dangerous conditions. In the late 20th century, the term blood diamonds would enter public consciousness, referring to diamonds mined in war zones and sold to finance armed conflict. The glossy romance narrative had long obscured these realities, so when we ask, did engagement rings really start in antiquity? We now have to refine the question. Yes, rings existed in ancient and medieval betrothal practices, but the diamond engagement ring, the global symbol of romantic commitment, was reinvented in the context of empire, industrial mining, and modern advertising. The idea that this practice is timeless is part of the product itself. The myth enhances the ring's value. If a diamond ring feels like an ancient necessity, questioning it feels like questioning love itself. But history shows us something different. It shows us layers of reinvention, Roman contract, medieval sacrament, early modern variation. And then, a dramatic 19th and 20th century transformation fueled by colonial extraction and corporate storytelling. None of this means that the emotions people feel when they give or receive a ring are fake. Love is real. Commitment is real. The joy of choosing a partner is real. But the object we use to symbolize those feelings has a history shaped by power and profit. The diamond engagement ring is not an unbroken inheritance from Rome. It is a modern tradition that borrowed fragments of the past to legitimize itself. It is a case study in how capitalism can take an existing custom, amplify one version of it, and present it as ancient destiny. So, right or wrong? If the claim is that diamond engagement rings are an ancient tradition handed down unchanged from antiquity, the answer is clearly wrong. They are, instead, a relatively recent invention, one that successfully convinced millions of people that it had always been there. And in the next chapter, we'll see how that invention became so powerful that it reshaped not only consumer habits, but the very way societies imagine love, success, and commitment in the modern world. By the mid-20th century, something remarkable had happened. In the United States, and increasingly across parts of Europe and Japan, a diamond engagement ring was no longer a luxury for the elite. It was becoming a social expectation. Proposals without diamonds felt incomplete. A ring box opening to reveal anything less than a sparkling stone risked disappointment. And yet, as we've seen, this was not the continuation of an ancient, unbroken tradition. It was the result of a deliberate cultural transformation. So how did that transformation become so powerful that it reshaped the emotional landscape of love itself? How did a product tied to colonial mining operations become a global ritual that feels intimate, personal, and timeless? The answer lies in a three-way alliance: corporate strategy, mass media, and the social anxieties of the 20th century. After the success of early advertising campaigns in the 1930s and 1940s, De Beers did not simply sell diamonds. It sold a story. The slogan, "A diamond is forever," was only the beginning. The company and its advertising partners worked tirelessly to embed diamonds into the scripts of everyday life. They supplied diamonds to Hollywood costume departments. They encouraged screenwriters to include proposal scenes featuring diamond rings. They ensured that celebrity engagements were widely publicized, with careful attention paid to the size and quality of the stone. Hollywood became a powerful amplifier. Romantic comedies and melodramas of the 1940s and 1950s often centered on courtship, aspiration, and marriage. The diamond ring became a visual shorthand. It signaled not just love, but success. A man who could present a diamond was stable, serious, and capable. A woman who received one was chosen, valued, and socially elevated. In this sense, the engagement ring became entangled with post-war ideals. After World War II, many Western societies experienced economic expansion alongside intense pressure to conform to domestic norms. In the United States, especially, the 1950s celebrated the nuclear family: breadwinning husband, homemaking wife, suburban house, well-behaved children. Marriage rates rose. The age of first marriage dropped. The engagement ring slotted neatly into this narrative as the glittering gateway to respectable adulthood. But the ritual was not merely romantic. It was disciplinary. The expectation that a man should spend a significant portion of his income on a ring reinforced the idea that masculinity was tied to financial provision. The 2-month salary guideline, popularized through advertising, functioned as both aspiration and pressure. It normalized the idea that love should be measured in monetary terms. For women, the ring operated as both prize and proof. It marked a transition from singlehood to a socially validated partnership. In an era when economic opportunities for women were still limited and social stigma surrounded unmarried adulthood, the engagement ring carried heavy symbolic weight. It was not just jewelry, it was security, status, and public recognition. This is where the myth of antiquity did important work. By suggesting that engagement rings were ancient, natural, and universal, advertisers masked the relatively recent origin of these expectations. If the ritual is timeless, it cannot easily be questioned. It feels like common sense. Meanwhile, De Beers carefully managed supply to maintain the illusion of rarity. Despite increased mining output in the 20th century, the company stockpiled diamonds and controlled their release onto the market. Scarcity was engineered. The high price of diamonds was not simply a reflection of geological rarity, but of market manipulation. And yet, consumers did not experience this as manipulation. They experienced it as romance. The emotional success of the diamond engagement ring depended on its ability to feel personal. The proposal moment, often staged as a surprise, became a narrative climax. The ring box opening became a ritualized gesture. Kneeling, asking the question, revealing the stone, these elements crystallized into a script repeated across generations. What makes a ritual powerful is repetition combined with belief. By the late 20th century, millions of couples had participated in similar proposal scenes. Each one felt unique. Each one felt like a spontaneous expression of love. Yet collectively, they formed a pattern shaped by corporate messaging and media imagery. The globalization of this ritual is equally revealing. In Japan, as mentioned earlier, diamond engagement rings were rare before the mid-20th century. Traditional marriage practices did not center on diamond proposals. But after World War II, Japan's rapid economic growth and exposure to Western media created fertile ground for new consumer rituals. De Beers launched targeted campaigns linking diamonds to modernity and international sophistication. Advertisements framed the diamond ring as part of a progressive, Western-style love marriage rather than an arranged match. By the 1980s, a majority of Japanese brides were receiving diamond engagement rings. A practice with little local historical precedent had become normalized within a few decades. This pattern repeated in other parts of the world. As global media expanded and Western romantic tropes circulated through film and television, the diamond ring traveled with them. In newly affluent middle classes from East Asia to parts of Latin America, the ring became a symbol of having arrived in modern consumer society. But we must not forget the shadow side of this global ritual. The 20th century saw not only expanded diamond consumption, but also brutal conflicts linked to diamond mining. In countries such as Sierra Leone and Angola, diamonds became entangled in civil wars. Rebel groups seized mines and sold so-called conflict diamonds to finance violence. Images of child soldiers and amputated civilians began to disrupt the clean narrative of eternal love. Public pressure in the late 1990s and early 2000s led to the creation of the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme, intended to prevent conflict diamonds from entering the mainstream market. While the process represented an acknowledgement of the problem, critics argue that enforcement has been inconsistent and that labor exploitation persists in various forms. The engagement ring, then, sits at the intersection of intimacy and empire. It is worn on the body as a symbol of personal commitment, yet its history is bound to colonial extraction, racialized labor systems, and global inequality. And still, the myth persists. Part of its resilience comes from how adaptable it has been. In recent years, new marketing strategies have reframed diamonds as symbols of female empowerment rather than male provision. Campaigns now target women purchasing diamonds for themselves. Same-sex couples have adapted the ritual to their own relationships, sometimes exchanging rings mutually. Alternative stones and ethical sourcing have gained popularity among those seeking to distance themselves from exploitative supply chains. These shifts demonstrate something important. Rituals are not fixed. They evolve. The engagement ring of the 21st century is already different from that of the 1950s, but the core expectation that a proposal involves a ring, ideally a diamond, remains remarkably strong. This is where we return to our guiding question. Right or wrong, did engagement rings begin in antiquity? By now, the answer is taking clearer shape. Yes, rings were used in ancient and medieval betrothals, but the global ritual centered on a diamond solitaire, framed as the ultimate proof of love, is largely a 19th and 20th century creation. It was not inherited unchanged from Rome. It was constructed through a convergence of corporate strategy, media storytelling, and shifting gender norms. What makes this story so powerful is that it reveals how easily economic interests can merge with emotional life. When a product becomes embedded in a life milestone, engagement, marriage, birth, it acquires protective insulation. To question the product feels like questioning the milestone itself. But history invites us to separate the two. Love does not require a diamond to exist. Commitment does not depend on geological carbon. The association between the two was built, reinforced, and globalized within living memory. And yet, acknowledging this does not mean stripping the ring of all meaning. It means recognizing that meaning is made, not inherited intact from the distant past. It means seeing the engagement ring not as a relic of antiquity, but as a mirror reflecting the economic and cultural forces of the modern world. In the final chapter, we will step back and weigh the full arc of the story. If engagement rings did not begin as romantic symbols in antiquity, why do we keep telling ourselves that they did? And what does that reveal about our relationship to tradition, history, and the stories we choose to believe? We began with a simple but powerful question: right or wrong, did engagement rings really start in antiquity? At first glance, the answer seems straightforward. Yes, ancient Romans used betrothal rings. Yes, medieval Christians incorporated rings into marital promises. The practice of marking commitment with a band of metal is undeniably old. But as we moved through the layers of history, Roman contract, medieval canon law, colonial mining, 20th century advertising, the clarity of that simple yes began to dissolve. Now, at the end of this journey, we need to bring the threads together, not just to answer the question, but to understand why the question matters. Let's start with the narrowest version of the claim. If someone says, engagement rings date back to ancient Rome, are they entirely wrong? No. There is historical evidence that Roman betrothal ceremonies included the giving of a ring. These rings symbolized an agreement to marry. In that limited sense, there is a line, thin but real, connecting antiquity to the present. But if the claim is that today's engagement ring, especially the diamond solitaire framed as a symbol of eternal romantic love, is a direct survival from ancient times, then that claim collapses under scrutiny. The Roman ring was embedded in a system of property transfer and patriarchal authority. The medieval ring was shaped by church law, sacramental theology, and intense concern over legitimacy and sexual control. The diamond engagement ring, as a mass expectation, emerged only after the 19th century discovery of South African diamond fields and the 20th century marketing campaigns that fused carbon crystals with the language of eternity. So the most honest answer to our right or wrong question is this: partially right in the most basic sense, but fundamentally misleading in the way it is usually told. And that distinction between technical continuity and cultural reinvention is exactly where myths thrive. The myth of the ancient engagement ring works because it simplifies. It compresses centuries of transformation into a single, comforting narrative. It tells us that when someone kneels with a diamond ring, they are participating in a ritual unchanged for thousands of years. It suggests permanence in a world that often feels unstable, but history shows us something more dynamic and in many ways more interesting. Traditions are not fossils. They are living constructions. They are shaped by law, religion, economics, empire, media, and emotion. They are revised, repackaged, and sometimes strategically invented. Why, then, are we so attached to the idea of antiquity? Part of the answer lies in legitimacy. Practices that can claim ancient roots feel authoritative. They seem tested by time. When jewelers or advertisers hint at Roman origins, they are not just offering trivia. They are offering reassurance. They are saying, this is not a trend. This is civilization. In Western societies especially, classical antiquity has long functioned as a cultural anchor. Architecture, political philosophy, legal systems, so much has been traced back to Greece and Rome that invoking antiquity carries weight. To link the engagement ring to Rome is to wrap it in prestige. But this move also obscures discontinuity. It erases the centuries in which engagement rings were not standardized, not diamond-centered, not universally expected. It smooths over the radical transformation brought about by industrial mining and corporate advertising. And perhaps most importantly, it hides the power structures embedded in each stage of the ring's history. In Rome, the ring marked a woman's transition from one male authority to another. In medieval Europe, it functioned within systems that regulated women's sexuality and secured legitimate heirs. In the modern era, it became tied to expectations about male earning power and female desirability. Even today, though norms are shifting, the engagement ring often reflects lingering assumptions about gender roles and economic display. This does not mean that every ring is oppressive or that every proposal reenacts patriarchy. People reinterpret rituals in creative ways. Couples of all genders now exchange rings. Some reject diamonds in favor of ethical stones or family heirlooms. Some forego rings altogether. The meaning of the engagement ring continues to evolve. But evolution is precisely the point. The ring is not a static inheritance from antiquity. It is a cultural object constantly reshaped by the needs and values of the present. There is also a global dimension to consider. The popular narrative centers Europe and North America, tracing a line from Rome to medieval Christendom to modern Western consumer culture. But marriage rituals across Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Middle East have followed diverse paths. Bride wealth systems, contractual gifts like the mahr, symbolic garments, shared meals, commitment has been marked in countless ways. The global dominance of the diamond engagement ring is not the triumph of an ancient universal custom. It is the spread of a particular modern Western model through media, marketing, and economic influence. Recognizing that fact allows us to see the ring not as destiny, but as diffusion. And then there is the question of labor and extraction. When someone says, "This tradition goes back to Rome," the image that comes to mind is marble columns and classical statues, not colonial mining compounds or conflict zones. The myth of antiquity distracts from the modern supply chains that make diamonds available at scale. It makes the ring feel rooted in distant history rather than in 19th century imperial expansion or 20th century corporate strategy. History does not demand that we reject the ring, but it does invite us to see the full picture. There is something deeply human about marking transitions with objects. Anthropologists have long noted that rites of passage, birth, coming of age, marriage, death, are often accompanied by material symbols. Objects help make intangible commitments visible. They anchor memory. They signal change to the community. In that sense, the impulse behind the engagement ring is not new. Humans have always used material culture to express social bonds. What is specific and historically contingent is the particular form that expression takes. A simple iron band in Rome, a silver feed ring in medieval Europe, a diamond solitaire in 1950s America, a lab-grown stone in the 21st century. Each reflects its own economic realities, technologies, and moral landscapes. So why does it matter whether the diamond engagement ring is truly ancient? It matters because myths about origins shape how we think about choice. If a practice feels ancient and universal, it feels inevitable. Questioning it feels like rejecting tradition itself. But when we see that a practice is relatively recent and historically constructed, we regain a sense of agency. We can ask, do we want to continue this? Do we want to modify it? What values do we want it to reflect? For some couples, knowing the history may deepen appreciation. They may see their ring as part of a long, evolving story of human commitment. For others, it may inspire alternatives, vintage rings, non-diamond stones, shared purchases, or entirely different symbols. The point is not to dictate a correct choice. It is to dismantle the illusion that there has only ever been one. In History vs. Myths, we are less interested in debunking for the sake of cynicism than in opening space for understanding. The engagement ring myth is not malicious in the way some historical distortions are. It does not justify conquest or erase genocide, but it does reveal how easily commercial interests can reshape collective memory. It shows us how a corporation can take fragments of history, Roman rings, medieval vows, aristocratic diamonds, and weave them into a narrative that feels seamless and eternal. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that love itself does not belong to any one era, object, or marketing campaign. Love existed before diamonds. It existed before iron rings. It existed before written contracts and church sacraments. It has taken countless forms across cultures and centuries. The engagement ring is one way, just one, of making that love visible. So, right or wrong? Wrong, if we mean that the modern engagement ring is a direct, unchanged survival from antiquity. Wrong, if we imagine a timeless diamond tradition stretching back to Rome. Wrong, if we believe that the ritual we know today is simply human nature expressed in gold and stone. But partially right, if we acknowledge that humans have long used rings to mark promises of marriage. There is continuity, but it is layered with reinvention. The real story is not about a single origin point in ancient Rome. It is about transformation, about how institutions of property became sacraments, how sacraments intersected with capitalism, and how capitalism harnessed emotion to create global ritual. In the end, the engagement ring is less a relic of antiquity and more a mirror of modernity. And once we understand that, we are free, not to abandon tradition necessarily, but to approach it with open eyes, aware of the histories embedded in even the smallest circle of gold.